Hi, I'm here for the Appendix B assignment from the Creswell text. I kind of accidentally pulled from the old version of the book, which actually has different appendices. And so the article, though, from this 1998 version, I think is really just too good to pass up. The QR code up in the corner will take you to the article if you have the newer version of the text and you're trying to look at the original article. Is go through it. The article is listed as a biography. I think really it'd be more fairly characterized as a narrative, because although it does tell the story of a single person, that story is told mostly through a single event in a narrative format. And so what I would like to do is kind of go through what the article tells us, and then how that's kind of characteristic of biography as a qualitative research method. And so the article is On the Bus with Vonnie Lee by Michael Angracino, written in 1993, I think republished in 1994. So Vonnie Lee is a 29-year-old with mental retardation who lives in a Florida city. A self-quote for how he describes his family is poor white trash, real crackers. And that idea of using direct quotes from Vonnie is something that the researcher does repeatedly in this article, which I think really helps to contextualize who Vonnie is as a person. Vonnie's father, mostly absent, his mother is an alcoholic. And so the first characteristic of biography, which we'll kind of keep characteristics over here on the side, first characteristic is that it is contextualized. And so we have a framework for understanding this event. It's not meant to be generalized. And so if we aren't generalizing it, we really have to understand the context in which the observations were made. And so Vonnie here was infrequently sent to school, developed some serious learning deficits, and as a teen, and actually I think at about the age of 12, starts living on the streets, grows up under a man named Lucian, and later in Vonnie's life, Lucian's found beaten to death, and Vonnie really reacts poorly to this and is institutionalized just kind of in his distraught reaction. And so one of these other characteristics of biography, and I think this is a great example of that, is it's retrospective. And so we are able to, from our present viewpoint, look back at events and understand their significance. So as these events were happening, being infrequently in school, living on the streets, that sort of thing, I don't think we could have understood the long-term impacts that would have on Vonnie, but from our current viewpoint looking back, we can, which gives us some useful information. And so Vonnie spends a few years in and out of psychiatric facilities, received a dual diagnosis of mental retardation and psychiatric disorder, and in 1992 was deemed ready for supervised independent living, which is the point where basically most of the article takes off. So it goes into a narrative, and so this is really told as a story. It's not presented as a list of facts or questions and data supporting it, but it's a story, and it picks up at this deemed ready for supervised independent living point in Vonnie's life. And so the researcher here uses a lot of direct quotes and reframed ideas from Vonnie himself to identify who he is as a person. And so there's a lot of kind of informal questioning that takes place in the narrative, and that informal questioning he uses to frame just who is this as a person, and what is the events that take place here, what's their significance for him. And so what's critically important in this story is just the detailed observation, and the fact that the researcher noticed things that might otherwise be insignificant that are going on, and not only notice them but recognize their significance. And so that one of the things he noticed was that Vonnie, when he talks about himself, he talks about himself anecdotally and narratively. And so he doesn't describe himself in terms of literal facts about himself, but he describes himself in terms of stories that I think represents who he is as a person. And so the event that takes place here, that the narrative centered around, the researcher who works at one of these mental health facilities takes Vonnie on a bus ride as part of his preparation for independent living. Since he's going to live on his own and work on his own, he needs to be able to use public transport to get in between those two places. And so the researcher takes Vonnie on the bus ride. And I want to point out that the researcher did have an existing relationship with Vonnie, which is important, I think, in kind of reframing that is not just an outside researcher, but really a participant in the study itself. And so notice just kind of several things that Vonnie really enjoyed visiting neighborhoods that he hadn't been in a while. As he changed different buses, he had to make a few bus switches to get through from his place he's going to live to his job. And he always liked getting a seat near the logo. And so that was kind of a difficulty when he couldn't get the seat he wanted. And one of the things that was not the purpose of the study, but the researcher noticed going through this narrative, is that there's actually difficulties in the bus system itself, or were at the time, for individuals with mental disabilities. And so there's folks that are using it, that there's just difficulties in the system. And the researcher pointed out that really was kind of a long ride, a long process for someone to get from their apartment or from their housing to work, much shorter than someone who can drive themselves. Which is interesting because it's not the purpose of the study, but it is an interesting finding that could help people who work with adults with mental disabilities. So the thing that I think is really just incredibly interesting in this article is that the researcher uses this narrative as a metaphor of self-identity. So, in the previous slide, it was naturalistic in nature. The setting was just allowed to flow organically and wasn't staged or wasn't manipulated like an experiment. But what the researcher does is he moves past saying this is a simple event or simple stories, but this is really a metaphor for who Vonnie is as a person. And so for Vonnie growing up, he saw the people on the bus, public transport, which for the researcher says, he himself thought of public transportation as kind of a lower class in society or something that people tried to avoid. Vonnie saw people on the bus as people who had somewhere to go, and that those people were important enough they had somewhere to go. That's why they're riding the bus. And so for Vonnie, riding the bus wasn't just a practical thing of I need to get to work. It represented for him progress in his life, because then he's important enough to have somewhere to go and use that to get to his job. And so for him, this isn't a practical story of how does someone with mental disabilities get from home to work in a supervised and independent living, but really for him represents growth and progression, which puts a lot more significance on it than just the very practical level. And so that is a really important distinction, that this biography as a tool and narratives as a tool have the opportunity to move past the practical information there to understand the significance and the metaphor of it, which could have great application for people working in these settings. So biography is, in a lot of ways, it's a type of ethnography, and it's a lot of times it focuses on folks that are marginalized or even just individuals. And so in ethnography, we're more typically maybe think of looking at a larger group. A lot of times this may even be a chance of just looking at people that are outside of the typical research population or sample population. And so the idea of using the narrative is taking detailed observation and putting it within a context to understand this individual or understand this group. And understanding that the actions or events are metaphors for the subject's self-identity. And so that metaphor value is really what gives, I think, this a great tool. I really enjoyed going through it because it's a very different perspective for me. One of the things I really think is worth noting in the researcher is that they're just a very skilled writer. And so for me personally, a lot of times I think about the data collection and experimental design and its significance in a research project. And I kind of put a lot of value on that, which obviously there is value in that. But just the artistic communication of information in a way that really helps the reader connect with the idea and understand this individual and then be able to consider their perspective, I think has a lot of value. It has a lot of value in education, especially when we are looking at folks outside of, the typical, one standard deviation, from the mean sort of group, which makes this, I think, a very powerful tool for educational researchers.